All right, welcome back, everyone. If you're here, you're probably the kind of person who loves those big brain-bending questions, the kind that really make you think about life, the universe, and everything. You want to grapple with those huge ideas, right? But without drowning in a sea of jargon.
Right.
So today we're going deep, really deep.
Deep dive time.
We're tackling one of those questions that has been debated for centuries. Do we actually have free will? Or is everything in our lives, every choice, already set in motion? Like a cosmic script we're just acting out.
And you know what makes this deep dive extra juicy? The source material really shakes things up. It argues that maybe, just maybe, this whole either it's free will or everything's predetermined thing is a bit of a false choice, a trap even.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So it's not as black and white as we often assume.
Not necessarily. See, we're going to explore a whole spectrum of ideas. We'll unpack predeterminism, that hardcore idea that everything's locked in. Then we'll look at the broader concept of determinism. And finally, we'll grapple with this fascinating alternative our source presents, self-determinism.
Self-determinism. I like the sound of that already. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's make sure everyone's on the same page. This whole conversation revolves around something called causality. What exactly are we talking about when we say causality?
Basically, it's just cause and effect. It's this fundamental idea that one thing leads to another. Our source points out that in physics, I'm talking about classical physics here, not the weird world of quantum stuff, it's kind of a given that every physical event has a cause. Something that came before it and made it happen. Nothing just pops up out of thin air.
Right, that makes sense. One thing leads to another. And that brings us to determinism. It's a word that gets thrown around a lot, often with slightly different meanings depending on who's using it. How does our source define determinism, especially when it's linking it to physics?
So they specifically focus on causal determinism, as it's understood in physics. This basically means that the state of any physical object, like where it is, how fast it's moving, things like that, are completely determined by the states that came before it, all governed by those unchanging laws of physics.
Okay, so far so good. But the source is very careful to point out that this is about the state of physical stuff, not about our thoughts or choices.
Exactly. That's a super important distinction. It's not saying that our intentions or desires are somehow irrelevant.
Okay, good. Because that leads us to what people usually worry about when they think about this stuff. It's predeterminism, or what our source also calls hard determinism. What's the gist of that?
Well, it's basically causal determinism, but taken to the extreme. It's the belief that every single event, from the beginning of the universe to the end, including every thought you've ever had and every action you'll ever take, is already set in stone. Every little detail, fixed and unchangeable.
So like fate or destiny.
Sort of, but much more rigid. And to be honest, our source is highly skeptical of this whole predeterminism thing. They even call it superstitious woo.
Superstitious woo, that's pretty blunt.
Right. And they use this really funny example. They say, according to hard determinism, the exact number of times you'll brush your teeth next New Year's Eve is already determined. Like it's out there, etched in the fabric of reality.
Okay, I think I get where they're coming from. It does sound a bit out there. So, hard determinism is out the window. That brings us to this alternative, self-determinism. What's the story there?
Self-determinism, in this context, is the idea that our actions, choices, everything we do is shaped by our experience, our past, our knowledge. It's kind of this middle ground. It allows for a sense of agency, what the source calls intelligent agency, in universe where cause and effect still rule. And there are a few key ingredients to self-determinism according to the source. Our awareness of time, our ability to imagine things, the mental feedback loops in our brains, and this thing called reciprocal causality.
Reciprocal causality, huh? That's definitely one we'll need to dig into. But first, let's define a couple more terms the source lays out. Inanimate matter versus animate beings. Seems pretty basic, but why is this distinction important here?
Yeah, it seems simple, but it's crucial for understanding the source's argument. So inanimate matter is basically anything that isn't a living creature capable of moving on its own. Think rocks, water, planets. Not plants, though, because they don't really move around independently. And animate beings, well, that's us, animals, creatures that can move and interact with the world. The source argues that animate beings interact with cause and effect in a fundamentally different way than inanimate matter does.
Okay, interesting. We're not just rocks being pushed around by forces. There's something more going on.
Exactly. And the universe, for most of its history, was just inanimate matter, right? So it makes sense that there would be these different levels of interaction with causality.
Okay, and then we have intelligence. How does the source define that in this discussion?
They define it as the ability to not just perceive cause and effect, but also understand it, remember it, and, most importantly, anticipate it. See those patterns and predict what might happen next. And the source even suggests that self-determinism might be a part of what intelligence actually is. It's like a natural outcome of being able to think about cause and effect in this sophisticated way.
Okay, that makes sense. To make choices, you kind of have to be able to anticipate the consequences, right?
Exactly. And then there's this final term, consciousness. The source doesn't see consciousness as just some internal thing happening in our heads. How do they explain it? They describe consciousness as this dynamic interaction between three things: a brain complex enough to process sensory information, a sensory system that can detect stuff in the world around us, and, well, the external world itself with all its causal events. They argued that without all three of these pieces working together, you wouldn't have consciousness as we experience it. It's not just in our heads. It's this whole interactive loop.
Okay, so consciousness is not just internal, but arises from this interplay with the world. That's fascinating. Now, back to this idea that the source challenges hard determinism. Why do they argue that it presents a false choice? What's at the heart of their argument?
Well, they say that hard determinism kind of boxes us in. It gives us this simplistic either everything is absolutely predetermined, or we have this magical free will that somehow exists outside of cause and effect. And they argue that this misses the point entirely. It ignores this whole other possibility, self-determinism, this way of understanding choice and agency that actually bridges the gap.
Yeah.
They also point out that this whole concept of free will, as it's usually understood, is pretty vague. Like, what does it actually mean? It's almost as slippery and undefined as the concept of God.
I'm sensing a bit of a theme here. Our source really likes to challenge those fuzzy, undefined concepts.
Definitely. They're all about clarity and rigor. So if hard determinism isn't the full picture, how does this idea of self-determinism come into play? What are the key elements that make it possible?
Yeah, let's unpack that. What makes self-determinism tick?
One of the most important things, according to the source, is our awareness of time. That we can perceive time passing, remember the past, and anticipate the future. They call this time awareness, or chronoreception. And they argue that this gives us a huge advantage in how we interact with cause and effect. It's like having a temporal advantage.
A temporal advantage, like being able to see a few moves ahead in a chess game.
Exactly. Because we can anticipate future events, we can make plans, prepare for things. Think about writing a to-do list. That's based on this awareness of time, right? You're thinking about the future and taking steps to shape it, or planning your career, or even just deciding what to wear tomorrow. These are all actions rooted in our ability to look ahead and act accordingly. And the source sees this proactive engagement with time as central to intelligent agency and self-determinism.
Okay, that makes sense. Our ability to think about and plan for the future really does feel like a big part of what makes us feel like we have control over our lives.
Yeah, it's not just being swept along by the current. It's being able to navigate.
You also mentioned earlier that animate and inanimate things have different ways of responding to causality. Could you elaborate on that a bit more?
Yeah, so the source makes this distinction between what they call reactive linear causality, which is how inanimate objects work, and interactive reciprocal causality, which is more characteristic of living beings, especially us humans.
Okay, I'm curious. What's the difference?
Imagine a rock, right?
Yeah.
If you push it, it moves in a predictable direction. One cause, one effect. That's linear causality. It's simple and direct. But animate beings, we don't just react passively to causes. We can interact with them, influence them, even change them.
Okay, so we're not just rocks rolling down a hill.
Definitely not.
Right.
We have this ability to step in and change the course of things.
You mentioned some specific characteristics of causality in inanimate world. What are those?
So in the realm of rocks and water and planets, causality is basically linear, right? It's just a straightforward chain of cause and effect. It's also binary, one cause, one effect. And it's consistent, repeatable, predictable. Like, if you drop a ball, it will fall every time. The source actually emphasizes that these very properties of order and predictability are what make intelligence possible in the first place. Intelligence needs a stable foundation of predictable cause and effect to function.
Okay, so in a way, the predictability of the physical world is what allows us to be intelligent. But if that's true, how does intelligence and this self-determinism thing even emerge?
That's a great question. And the source argues that self-determinism emerges from the interplay between this predictable determinism and our intelligence. And the key to this whole interaction is something called feedback.
Feedback. Okay, that sounds familiar. Like in a sound system, you get that screeching feedback.
Kind of, but not quite that annoying. Think of it more like you take an action, you see the results, and then you adjust your next action based on what you learned.
Okay, I think I'm getting it. So it's like learning from our mistakes and adjusting our course.
Exactly. And inanimate matter, it doesn't have that. Rocks don't learn, they don't remember, they don't have intentions, they just react. But living beings, especially with brains like ours, we have these feedback mechanisms that allow us to interact with cause and effect. We're not just being pushed around, we're actively participating.
So it's not just one-way traffic with cause and effect. We can influence the flow.
Precisely. And this is where reciprocal causality comes in. It's this idea that we can change the causal chain itself through our actions and choices.
It's like our actions become part of the cause and effect sequence, not just a result of it.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting. Because the source argues that even in a deterministic universe, this doesn't necessarily mean we have no choice.
Okay, that's counterintuitive. How can determinism and choice exist together? Well, think about something simple, like choosing what to eat. The options you have might be determined by what's in your fridge or the menu at a restaurant. But the act of choosing, the actual decision, that's still you. Your preferences, your memories of past meals, maybe even your health goals, these all factor in, right? So determinism might set the stage, but it doesn't dictate the specific play you choose to perform.
Okay, so determinism sets the limits, but within those limits, we still have the power to choose.
Exactly. And this is where the brain comes in. Our brains are like these incredible integration machines. They're constantly processing information from our past experiences, those memories, our hopes and fears about the future, our imagination, and all the sensory information coming in from the world right now.
And through this intricate web of mental feedback loops, the brain synthesizes all of this into perceptions, ideas, conclusions, and ultimately, our decisions.
It's like our brains are these amazing prediction machines, constantly running simulations based on past experience and future projections.
Exactly. And the source has this beautiful way of describing memory and imagination. They call them virtualized extensions of causality, because they allow us to consider scenarios beyond the immediate present, to think about what happened before and what might happen next. And that's something that simply doesn't exist in the linear causality of the inanimate world. Rocks don't have memories or imaginations, they're stuck in the now. But we're not.
That's a powerful image. We're not just reacting to the present, we're carrying the past and the future within us.
Exactly. And this leads to these more complex forms of causality we see in living things.
Yeah.
Reciprocal causality, iterative causality, recursive causality. Cause and effect can loop back on themselves, twist and turn, all thanks to our memories and our ability to anticipate. And the source argues that this synthesis of causal factors spanning time is what gives rise to intelligence and self-determinism. It's not about some magical uncaused cause or separating the mind from the body. It all happens within a deterministic universe, but in this much more nuanced and dynamic way.
It's almost like our brains are creating these internal models of the universe, and we're using those models to make choices, not just reacting, but actually shaping the causal flow.
Exactly. And this ability to choose, the source argues, is fundamental to intelligence itself. Like, can you imagine what intelligence would even look like without the capacity to evaluate options and make decisions, to say, I prefer this outcome to that one? It doesn't really compute. Linear causality might define what's physically possible, but it's reciprocal causality, fueled by our ability to anticipate and plan, that gives us the power to navigate those possibilities, to steer the ship, so to speak.
And the act of planning itself, that seems to be a strong indicator of this intelligence at work, right?
Absolutely. The fact that we plan, that we think about the future and make choices based on those plans, suggests that our intelligence is not just about recognizing cause and effect, but about actively tracking our choices in relation to our desired future states. And for any complex goal, any significant achievement, those choices have to be iterative, recursive. We make a choice, we see the results, we adjust, we make another choice. And feedback, as we've been discussing, is the essential ingredient that guides this whole process.
Yeah.
It allows us to learn and refine our choices over time.
The source uses the example of moon missions, right, as this incredible feat of planning and anticipation. Like, we literally planned to send humans to the moon, and we did it. It's mind-blowing when you think about it.
It really is. And it highlights the stark contrast with a purely deterministic view that might say, well, it was all just a consequence of the initial conditions of the universe. The source argues that this reductionist mindset you often find in hard determinism misses the mark because it doesn't account for this crucial element of reciprocal causality, this ability to not just react, but to interact with cause and effect in this incredibly sophisticated way.
So the source is saying that hard determinism gets something fundamentally wrong about how it views living beings.
Yeah, they argue that it makes the mistake of trying to apply the rules of linear causality, which are fine for rocks and planets, to living, breathing, thinking creatures. And that's just not how we operate. Reciprocal causality is the name of the game when it comes to living systems, especially brains like ours. It's like trying to understand a computer by only looking at the individual transistors. You're missing the whole picture. And they also point out that we already accept that things like consciousness and intelligence emerge from simpler components, right?
Right. Like we don't expect to find a little consciousness molecule floating around in the brain. It's a product of the complex interactions of all those neurons and synapses and whatnot.
Exactly. And the source uses the emergence of life itself as an analogy. Like, life arose from these relatively simple chemical interactions. So why couldn't something like self-determinism, this ability to make choices and shape our future, arise from the incredibly complex electrochemical processes happening in our brains? Especially considering that we already acknowledge consciousness and intelligence as emergent properties, it's not that far a leap.
So the argument is that if those complex abilities can emerge from simpler components, then why not self-determinism? It's just another level of complexity.
Exactly. And the source concludes by emphasizing that the idea of consciousness, intelligence, and ultimately self-determinism arising from deterministic processes becomes much more plausible when you take into account this powerful concept of reciprocal causality. It's the missing ingredient.
It all comes back to feedback, doesn't it? This ability to learn and adjust and shape the causal flow.
Absolutely. It's the key that unlocks the door to self-determinism.
So if self-determinism is this real thing, this active force in our lives, where do we see it showing up? Not just in these grand examples like moon missions, but in our everyday experience.
Well, the source points out that the very structure of our society suggests that we implicitly believe in self-determinism. Our legal systems, our markets, our systems of rewards and punishments, even our everyday interactions where we praise or blame each other, all of these operate under the assumption that individuals have the capacity to make choices and are responsible for those choices. And on a more personal level, as we discussed earlier, we're constantly engaged in this dance with the future. We're weighing options, considering possibilities, making decisions based on our values, our goals, our hopes, our fears. We live our lives as if self-determinism is true, even if we don't always consciously acknowledge it.
It's like self-determinism is woven into the fabric of our existence.
Exactly. And that leads to the source's final point.
Uh-huh.
They say the real challenge isn't to deny this thing that feels so fundamental to our experience, but to understand it better, to develop a deeper explanation of how self-determinism actually works within a universe that ultimately operates on cause and effect. They believe that the traditional hard deterministic view, with its rigid, either it's predetermined or it's random framework, is likely a false dichotomy.
Yeah.
It's missing this crucial piece of the puzzle, reciprocal causality, this interaction between our intelligent agency and the causal flow of the universe.
So the takeaway for our listeners today is that this relationship between cause and effect, especially when we're talking about living beings with intelligence and the ability to envision the future, is much more complex and dynamic than a simple predetermined chain of events.
It's more like an intricate dance.
Exactly. And this idea of self-determinism, with its emphasis on our awareness of time, the power of feedback, and this concept of reciprocal causality, offers a much more compelling way to understand how we can have genuine agency in our lives, how we can make choices that matter, even within a universe governed by cause and effect.
It allows us to see ourselves not just as products of the past, but as active participants in shaping the future.
And on that note, here's a final thought to ponder. As you reflect on your own life, on the journey that brought you to this very moment, and on the hopes and dreams that guide your steps into the future, ask yourself, how does this idea of reciprocal causality resonate with the choices you make every day? It's a powerful lens through which to view your own sense of agency and the forces that shape the course of your life.
We hope this deep dive has provided some food for thought
Some serious mental fuel.
and sparked some new ideas about this age-old question.
It's a fascinating conversation, and one that's certainly not over. We encourage you to keep exploring these intersections of philosophy, psychology, and the very nature of reality with us. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those questions coming.
And remember, the future is not set in stone. It's yours to shape.
Exactly. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
See you next time.
All right, signing off.